Ibrahim Traoré was not the kind of leader the world expected. When he first appeared on the international stage, barely in his 30s, many dismissed him as a temporary figure, a soldier who had stumbled into power in the turbulence of Burkina Faso's politics. But as time passed, and as his words began to echo far beyond the borders of his landlocked country, even his critics had to admit that something extraordinary was happening. The story begins on a cold morning in Geneva, at an international summit that had gathered world leaders to discuss Africa's future. The irony was not lost on Traoré. Here were the same nations that had drawn Africa's borders with rulers and ink, now sitting around polished wooden tables to tell Africans what kind of future they should have. He walked into the conference hall in his uniform, calm, disciplined, his face unreadable but his presence undeniable. Cameras followed his every step. Commentators whispered about his youth, his lack of diplomatic polish, his military past. But those who looked deeper saw something else. A man who carried the weight of his people's pain on his shoulders, yet stood tall with quiet dignity. When the chair of the summit gave the floor to him, the room fell into an uneasy silence. Traoré adjusted the microphone, looked across the hall filled with suits, ties, and carefully staged smiles, and spoke with a voice that was steady and unshaken. "You speak of Africa's future," he began. "But for centuries, you have written that future without us. You drew the borders, you drained the land, you dictated the rules. And now you gather here again, as if the destiny of 1 billion people can be decided in this room." Some leaders shifted uncomfortably. A few rolled their eyes, muttering that this was the usual rhetoric of defiance. But Traoré pressed on, his words sharpened by conviction. "Africa is not a child waiting for permission. We are not a continent of silence. We are not your resource pool, your battlefield, or your laboratory. We are a people with memory, with dignity, with the will to define our own destiny. And whether you recognize it or not, a new generation is rising, one that will no longer accept chains disguised as aid, or control disguised as partnership." The room stirred. Journalists leaned forward, typing furiously. Some diplomats whispered nervously into their earpieces, sending hurried updates back to their capitals. But for Traoré, this was not theatre. It was truth. He remembered the villages in his homeland where children studied by candlelight because electricity was scarce. He remembered the fields where farmers bent their backs under the burning sun while multinational companies siphoned away the profits. He remembered the faces of soldiers who had fought beside him, young men who dreamed only of peace but found themselves caught in wars, fed by weapons that came from the very nations now preaching stability. His life had not been one of privilege. He was born in a land where hope was often crushed by poverty and betrayal. Yet he carried within him a relentless belief that Burkina Faso, and Africa as a whole, deserved to stand with its head held high. And so he spoke, not just as a president, but as a son of Africa. "You talk of stability," he said, his voice gaining force. "But what you mean is control. You talk of development, but what you offer are loans that chain us for generations. You talk of peace, but you profit from the wars that tear us apart. No more. Africa will not be dictated to. Africa will not be managed like an estate. Africa will be free, because freedom is not a gift, it is a right." There was silence, a silence so heavy it felt like the walls themselves were listening. Then came the backlash. One European leader, red-faced, accused him of being ungrateful. Another suggested that without international support, countries like Burkina Faso would collapse. A third dismissed him outright. "You are too young to lecture us about history." But Traoré did not flinch. He looked each of them in the eye, and with a calmness that carried more weight than shouting ever could, he replied, "Perhaps I am young, but it is your generation that has left the world in flames. If youth means the courage to rebuild from the ashes, then I will not apologize. I stand not for myself, but for millions who have been silenced. And I tell you this, history will remember who stood with dignity, and who clung to arrogance." The hall erupted, not with applause, but with voices, debates, anger, and shock. Yet outside those walls, something far more powerful was happening. His words traveled across Africa within minutes. On radios in rural villages, on smartphones in crowded cities, on television screens in cafes and living rooms, people heard the voice of a man who dared to say what many had felt but feared to speak aloud. In Ouagadougou, young students marched with his image painted on banners. In Dakar, musicians wrote songs with his words as lyrics. In Lagos, activists quoted him in fiery speeches. Across the continent, the message was clear: Africa was waking up, and Ibrahim Traoré had become its symbol. But symbols come at a cost. The more his voice grew, the more powerful the opposition became. Behind closed doors, strategies were drafted to weaken him, to isolate Burkina Faso, to brand him as reckless. Yet every attempt only seemed to strengthen his resolve. For Traoré knew something his opponents did not: power built on fear is fragile, but power built on dignity endures. He returned from Geneva, not as the dismissed young captain, but as the voice of a rising tide. His speeches were replayed, dissected, celebrated, and condemned. He was loved by some, hated by others, but ignored by none. Months later, as he stood once again before his people in the capital, the crowd stretched as far as the eye could see. Farmers, workers, students, mothers carrying children on their backs, they had all come to hear him. And as he looked at them, he realized that leadership was not about titles or palaces. It was about carrying the heartbeat of a nation within you, and protecting it no matter the cost. He raised his hand, and the crowd grew silent. "I am not your savior," he said. "I am your servant. But together, we are the generation that refuses to be broken. Together, we are the proof that Africa is not the past, it is the future." The roar that followed shook the earth. And somewhere, far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso, the world listened. Because by then, Ibrahim Traoré was no longer just a president. He was a name that echoed across Africa and beyond, a symbol of strength, resistance, and dignity.